Did you know that transgender individuals are 4 times more likely to be victims of violent crime?
It's a chilling statistic.
It is, and it highlights the very real dangers that this community faces.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into one such case, the tragic story of Nikki Coonhousen,
Absolutely.
a 17-year-old transgender girl who was murdered back in 2019. And we're going to be using the Anatomy of Murder podcast episode as our guide
Right?
to kind of unpack all the different layers of this case.
Yeah, it's a case that really brings to light a lot of the threats that transgender individuals face.
Yeah.
And tragically, Nikki's story is not an isolated incident.
No, it's not. And before we jump into the investigation itself, I think it's important to, paint a picture of Nikki for our listeners.
Yeah.
She was a high school student living in Vancouver, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
She was really into beauty, like makeup and hairstyling.
Right.
And she dreamed of one day being a makeup artist and had a pretty big online presence.
Yeah.
Sharing her creativity with the world.
It sounds like she was really coming into her own.
Yeah.
And, finding a way to express herself.
Absolutely.
But it's also important to note that Nikki's life wasn't without its challenges.
Right.
She had a difficult upbringing dealing with parental addiction and instability.
It sounds like she was a pretty resilient young woman.
Yeah.
But in June of 2019, her online presence just went silent.
Right.
Her mom, Lisa, who was in constant contact with her, knew something was terribly wrong.
It must have been just terrifying for her.
Oh, absolutely.
To not know what happened.
To not know, and it took 3 weeks before any sort of lead emerged.
Right, and it was Lisa that actually discovered it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Nikki had borrowed a friend's phone the night that she vanished.
Okay.
And she used it to log into her Snapchat account.
So that Snapchat account became a digital lifeline.
Exactly.
To investigators.
Yeah, and by analyzing her Snapchat activity, they found messages exchanged between Nikki and a user named Bogdan David right around the time that she disappeared.
It's like a digital breadcrumb trail.
Yeah, exactly.
That led them to David Bogdanov.
Well, not quite.
Okay.
Tracking him down proved to be a little bit more difficult.
All right.
All of his phone numbers were disconnected. His family was giving conflicting information about his whereabouts.
That's suspicious.
Yeah, it really raises some red flags.
Yeah.
What might he be hiding?
Right.
And it actually took months of investigation.
Wow.
Using warrants and cell phone data analysis before they finally got a response from Bogdanov on Snapchat.
So they finally tracked him down.
Yeah, he eventually agreed to meet with the police for questioning.
Okay.
And his claim was that his phone had been off because he had unpaid bills.
Okay, so they finally got their suspect face to face.
Right.
Did he come clean about what happened to Nikki?
Not at all. In fact, his story was full of inconsistencies from the very beginning.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember that Nikki's disappearance was a huge news story,
Right.
but Bogdanov claimed to be completely unaware of it.
I find that hard to believe.
Yeah. So what was his explanation for his interactions with Nikki?
Yeah.
He told police that he'd met her while he was out with his brothers.
Okay.
And even offered her his jacket because she seemed cold.
Right.
They exchanged information, and later that night, Nikki messaged him asking for a ride.
Okay, that sounds normal enough.
Right. But here's where his story takes a disturbing turn.
Okay.
He claims that once they were in his van, Nikki revealed that she was transgender. And that this revelation completely changed his demeanor.
How so? Like, what do you mean by changed his demeanor?
Well, he claimed to be disgusted and disturbed by the fact that Nikki was transgender.
Wow.
He used those exact words.
That's awful.
And told police that he immediately kicked her out of his van.
I mean, that's just blatant transphobia.
It is.
Like, who reacts that way to someone just sharing their identity?
It's a deeply troubling response and a stark reminder of the prejudice that transgender individuals often face.
Yeah.
Now, while his words are reprehensible, prejudice alone doesn't make him a murderer.
Right, of course.
However, it does suggest a possible motive.
So investigators were obviously suspicious of his story.
Right.
Did they have any evidence to contradict his claims?
Well, remember how he said that he went straight to work after dropping Nikki off?
Right.
His cell phone records told a very different story.
Oh.
The data placed him on Larch Mountain, which is a remote area miles away from where he claimed to have left her.
Why lie about his whereabouts unless he had something to hide?
It's a huge discrepancy. It really raises a lot of questions.
Like, that's a pretty clear sign of guilt to me.
It seems that way, right?
Yeah.
But at this stage, they still needed more concrete evidence
Nice.
to connect him directly to Nikki's disappearance. It just makes you wonder, what really happened on that mountain.
Yeah, like that lie about Larch Mountain really casts a long shadow over everything else he said. And I can only imagine the agony that Nikki's loved ones must have felt during that time, not knowing what had happened to her.
Yeah, it was an excruciating wait for answers. And tragically, it would be months before the truth about what happened on Larch Mountain came to light.
So when did they finally, discover what happened to her?
Well, it was actually a civilian
Oh, wow.
out collecting bear grass on Larch Mountain for floral arrangements who stumbled upon her remains on December 7th, 2019.
Wow. So almost 6 months to the day after she disappeared.
Exactly.
It's heartbreaking.
A truly devastating discovery, and were investigators able to confirm it was Nikki?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Like, how did they know it was her?
Right, so there were several items found at the scene that pointed to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
There were hair extensions that match Nikki's last hairstyle.
Oh, wow.
A distinctive yellow jacket she was seen wearing in social media posts.
It's just so sad to think about, those personal belongings, once symbols of her individuality, becoming evidence in a murder investigation.
Yeah, you're right. It's really tragic.
Did the discovery provide any clues about how she died?
Well, a phone charging cable was found knotted around her neck,
Oh, God.
leaving no doubt about the cause of death.
So with Bogdanov's cell phone data placing it at that exact location on the night Nikki vanished, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to link him directly to the crime scene, right?
You would think so, but when they brought him back in for questioning and confronted him with this new information, he invoked his right to remain silent.
So it seems pretty clear that he knew he was caught. What happened next?
Well, he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and malicious harassment,
Okay.
which is considered a hate crime in Washington state.
So that means that prosecutors believe that Nikki's gender identity played a role in her murder.
Exactly. The prosecution's argument was that Nikki's murder was at least in part motivated by her being transgender.
That's just chilling.
It wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a targeted attack fueled by prejudice.
It's hard to believe that someone could be targeted for such a horrific crime simply for being who they are. What was the public reaction to Bogdanov's arrest?
It's understandable to feel that way. I mean, Nikki's case sparked outrage
I'm sure.
and sent shockwaves through the community.
Yeah.
It really became a rallying cry for justice and greater protections for transgender individuals.
So the stage was set for what was sure to be a high-profile trial.
Yeah.
Did the prosecution face any challenges in building their case against Bogdanov?
Oh, they certainly did. The case was assigned to a rookie prosecutor, Kristen Arno, for her very first trial.
Wow.
Talk about pressure.
Not only was it a complex and emotionally charged case, but it was also thrust into the national spotlight. What were some of the key challenges she faced?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles was the lack of direct physical evidence.
Okay.
There was no murder weapon, no confession.
Right.
And the time that had passed since the murder made it difficult to gather forensic evidence.
So they had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, like the digital trail cell phone records and witness testimony.
Exactly.
It sounds like they had their work cut out for them.
They did, and then just a month before the trial was set to begin, the defense threw a curveball.
What do you mean?
Bogdanov's lawyers announced he would be claiming self-defense.
Wait, so after months of denying any involvement, he suddenly changes his story and admits to killing Nikki, but claims it was self-defense.
They admitted he was responsible for Nikki's death,
That's suspicious.
but argued he had acted to protect himself.
It just seems like a very convenient time to change his story, don't you think?
It certainly raises eyebrows, and this is where we encounter a very controversial and offensive legal strategy known as the gay-trans panic defense.
Can you explain what that is for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Sure, it's a legal strategy that's based on the harmful premise that someone can be so overcome with panic upon discovering a partner's sexual orientation or gender identity that their violent actions are somehow justified.
So basically, they're arguing that simply being LGBTQIA+ is a threat that warrants a violent response.
Yeah, it's a deeply problematic defense strategy that has been increasingly challenged in courtrooms across the country.
I understand that Washington state actually passed legislation to address this very issue, right?
You're referring to Nikki's law.
Yes.
Thanks to the tireless advocacy of Nikki's mother, Lisa, and other activists, Washington state banned the use of the panic defense just a month before Bogdanov's trial.
What an incredible victory.
It was a huge step forward.
Even though it couldn't bring Nikki back, it shows the power of turning grief and anger into positive change.
Absolutely.
But even though the panic defense was off the table legally, Could the defense still try to use a similar argument?
Unfortunately, yes. While they couldn't explicitly use the panic defense,
Right.
they could still argue that Bogdanov had felt threatened by Nikki and acted in self-defense.
I see.
It highlights the reality that legal progress doesn't always erase deep-seated biases.
That's a really good point.
The prosecution knew they had a tough battle ahead of them,
Yeah.
proving that Bogdanov's actions were premeditated and motivated by hate.
So the trial begins. You've got a rookie prosecutor, a controversial defense strategy, and a community demanding justice for Nikki. What happened in the courtroom?
The trial began in September 2021, and it quickly became a battle of narratives.
Okay.
The defense tried to portray Bogdanov as the victim, someone who had been manipulated and then attacked by Nikki.
It's just hard to believe they would try to shift the blame like that, especially considering Bogdanov's blatant transphobia in his initial police interview.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. I mean, it's a tactic that often preys on existing biases and stereotypes about transgender individuals.
Right.
But the prosecution wasn't going to let that stand. They were ready to challenge Bogdanov's claims and present a very different picture of what happened that night.
So Bogdanov takes a stand. What does he say?
Well, at first he stuck to his original story about meeting Nikki and her later revealing that she was transgender. But then he claimed that Nikki became aggressive and threatened him, forcing him to defend himself.
Wait, is he seriously suggesting that Nikki, a 17-year-old girl, was the aggressor in this situation?
It's a common defense tactic in these types of cases.
I mean, it just seems incredibly far-fetched.
It does. It's an attempt to paint the victim as the aggressor and elicit sympathy for the defendant.
Right.
But the prosecution was prepared to dismantle this narrative.
Okay.
One of the key pieces of Bogdanov's story was that he had accidentally strangled Nikki with a phone charging cable while trying to restrain her. He claimed that the cord was looped and somehow tightened on its own, leading to her death.
Accidentally strangled with a phone charger. That's a pretty hard story to swallow.
It is. Did the prosecution have any evidence to refute that claim?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
They did. They brought in the medical examiner, who testified that the type and severity of injuries Nikki sustained were completely inconsistent with an accidental strangulation.
Oh, wow.
The medical examiner explained that it would have taken sustained force and time to inflict those injuries, directly contradicting Bogdanov's story.
So the prosecution was able to poke holes in his self-defense claims.
Yeah.
But what about his clear prejudice against transgender people? How do they address that in court?
That's where Bogdanov's own words and demeanor on the stand became incredibly incriminating.
Okay.
Prosecutors noted that throughout his testimony, he never expressed any remorse for Nikki's death. He seemed more concerned with how her being transgender would affect his reputation than with the fact that he had taken a human life.
It sounds like his actions and his words painted a pretty damning picture for the jury.
They did.
What was the verdict?
After 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Bogdanov guilty of second-degree murder and the hate crime of malicious harassment.
That must have been a huge relief for Nikki's family.
It was a huge victory for the prosecution and for Nikki's family and loved ones.
Yeah.
A powerful reminder that even in the face of hate and prejudice, truth and justice can prevail.
Absolutely.
Bogdanov was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the law.
Nikki's story is just a tragic reminder of the violence and discrimination that transgender individuals face far too often.
It is, but it's also a story of resilience, community, and the fight for justice.
And it highlights the importance of challenging prejudice and advocating for equality wherever we encounter it.
Absolutely.
The passage of Nikki's law in Washington state is a direct result of the advocacy and outrage sparked by her murder.
It's a powerful example of how a community can come together to create positive change in the face of tragedy.
Nikki's legacy lives on not only in the legal reforms enacted in her name, but also in the countless lives she touched and the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable world for all.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a world where everyone feels safe and accepted, regardless of their gender identity.
This case really underscores the importance of understanding the challenges faced by marginalized communities. And the need for continued progress in the fight for equality.
We can all make a difference by speaking out against injustice and working to create a more inclusive and compassionate world.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Nikki Coonhousen case.
Of course.
We encourage you to continue learning about this important issue and consider how you can contribute to a safer and more just world for everyone.
Absolutely.
And if you found this deep dive informative and insightful, be sure to subscribe to our podcast for more in-depth explorations of current events and social issues.
Yeah, and please share this episode with your friends and family.
Yes, spread the word.
Together, we can make a difference.